Well, it's wonderful to see everybody here this morning. If you're visiting with us, we're very glad that you're here. We certainly hope that you've been made to feel welcome and at home among us. We're a church family striving to serve and to love God to the very best of our abilities according to the authority of the Scriptures. And so if you have any questions about that, if you'd like to know why we do what we do, what drives and motivates us, if you'd like to know a little bit more about the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's just good news. That's what it means, is good news. And there's good news in this book for you as well. So if you're curious and you'd like to learn more, we'll open up our Bibles, we'll study together, and we'll get answers for the questions that you have. Or at the very least, we'll do our very best to do that. So at 9 o'clock this morning, I did part 1, and this is going to be part 2. But don't worry, I've divided the material up in such a way as I think that this is its own standalone lesson. So if you were not here for 9 o'clock, I highly encourage you. Please come back 9 o'clock next Sunday so you don't miss something. But I highly encourage you, please at some point this week, go back and listen to that 9 o'clock lesson. They're always available online on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/EastShelby. And I'll try to get that edited and prepared for public consumption at some point tomorrow. But please listen to that 9 o'clock lesson, that part 1. But let's sum it up just real quick here. I just want to sum up a little bit of what we talked about, and it'll just take a couple minutes so that we're all on the same page when we get here into part 2. So if you look at the Bible, if you're not very familiar with the Bible, maybe you've picked it up for the first time, or maybe you've always just had kind of a Reader's Digest understanding of what the Bible's all about, you'll notice it's divided up into 2 sections. A really big section called the Old Testament. That's like 2/3 of the Bible right there. And then there's another section, the New Testament, and that's not quite as big as the Old Testament. And you're thinking, all right, why is the Bible divided up in this way? What's the point of the Old Testament? What's the purpose of it? And I don't know, Ryan, I tried reading Exodus one time, and there's a lot of weird stuff in Exodus, a lot of rules in there that I don't think I've ever even tried to keep before. Stuff about mixing different fabrics in your clothes and certain foods that are unclean. I don't even know what it means that food is unclean. And then there's Leviticus and all those animal sacrifices. How come we don't have an altar anywhere? How come we're not burning incense? How come we don't have a priest who stands before us in a lot of funny looking clothes and rocks on his chest? There's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament I thought was all God's Word. And, you know, as Christians, aren't we supposed to be doing the Bible? We're supposed to be obeying the Bible and doing what God says. So why is it that like 2/3 of the Bible we're not even doing? That's a great question, and that's what we want to answer. At 9 o'clock, I asked, why do you not keep the commandments of God? And this was a slide from the 9 o'clock lesson. We'll go through it very, very quickly again so that we're all on the same page. And there are certain things from the Old Testament that tend to get a lot more traction than other things. Clearly, there's not a ton of people out there trying to enforce, like the mixing fabrics or lizards walking across your pottery and, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, there's not a lot of people trying to enforce those. But there are a lot of people who argue about the Sabbath day. Maybe in your conversations with religious friends, maybe it's come up on, well, why do you worship on Sunday? But our group still worships on Saturday. We still do the Sabbath day, and we're just doing what God says. Issues over the food laws and people who try to enforce as a religious ordinance. I want to be clear about that, but trying to enforce as a religious code the kosher food laws from the Old Testament. Or even other standards of clothes, like why don't we dress the same way that they do? And so there are a lot of modern applications to this question of why do you not keep the Old Testament. There's several passages up on the screen. We went through a couple of them at 9 o'clock. Deuteronomy 4, Exodus 31, Exodus chapter 20, all talk about the covenant that God made with Israel and how there's rules and laws, statutes and commandments that Israel was supposed to keep, most of which we see no application to today as far as keeping them as a law. And even Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 seems to be saying at first glance that we're also supposed to be keeping the old law. And I'll reread it. But in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. That's the Old Testament law. Not this, or he says, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and so teaches others shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And now the rubber really meets the road on certain issues. Again, when you're talking to a Sabbatarian, someone who continues to practice the Sabbath day as a religious ordinance, that is the day that Christians gather together and worship, and not the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, that's where the rubber really meets the road on this one. And of course, there's a lot of other applications, but that's one of the more common ones that we're going to talk about. Again, when we talk to our religious friends and we're trying to find points of commonality and also points of difference between them. Well, I think to answer this question, there's one New Testament passage in particular that you've got to have under your belt. And if you don't get this passage, if you don't understand what the writer's saying in this passage, I think you're always going to struggle with this question of why do we not do all that stuff in the Old Testament? And the passage is Hebrews 8. So have your Bibles open to Hebrews chapter 8. We're going to read the whole thing, the whole chapter. No, what's he going to do now? You're going to read the whole chapter because you have to read the whole chapter. You're lucky I'm not just reading the whole book of Hebrews. I don't know, that didn't quite come across the way I intended it. You're lucky I'm not reading more Bible verses at you. But for context's sake, and you really do have to have some of that context. If you're not familiar with the book of Hebrews, it's a New Testament book. And it's written to Christians. But these Christians come from a Jewish background. These are people who are culturally and ethnically Jewish. And they had, for their whole lives until they became Christians, they were following all of those Old Testament laws. The kosher laws with food, clothing standards, cleanliness standards, offering sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem, keeping Jewish holidays and festivals, and yes, keeping the Sabbath day. But then they learned about Jesus, and they became Christians. But then that life as a Christian wasn't kind of what they thought it would be. There was some persecution, some trials and challenges, and being a Christian really wasn't feeling very good to them. So the book of Hebrews is written to these Jewish Christians, these converts to Christ, who are thinking of backsliding, who are thinking of going back to Judaism, because just life was simpler back then. We had our law with our 600 some odd laws in it, and it was just easier when God micromanaged our lives. So we're kind of going back to that. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, no, don't go back to that. Don't replace the perfect thing that you have in Jesus with the imperfect thing that you had in the old law. Don't replace the substance of God in the new covenant with the copies and shadows that you had in the old covenant. The reason why we don't do the Old Testament as religious practice is because of Hebrews 8. And if you can get Hebrews 8, this whole question starts to make a lot more sense to you. And so he begins here in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 1. Now the main point in what has been said is this. I love, by the way, that I appreciate that the writer of Hebrews is going, if the first 7 chapters of this book have left you kind of swimming, let me slow it down and tell you what the main point is. I like that. I'm a guy, I need to know what the main point is. If you don't spell it out for me, I sometimes struggle with what the main point is. The main point in what has been said is this. Christians have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord set up, not man, not that tabernacle that you read about in the book of Exodus, Old Bezalel came in and helped design it. It was a beautiful thing, and God gave them the pattern, and they did what God commanded, and they made that tabernacle, and then they practiced the pattern of worship in that tabernacle from generation to generation to generation. And he's saying, that's not the substance. That was the copy. That was the shadow. That was the dim reflection of a heavenly thing that you can only have in its true and full sense in Jesus Christ. He goes on and says in verse 3, for every high priest, according to the old law, is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. So it's necessary that this high priest also have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law. Like, if you want the law, what he's saying is, I guess you don't need Jesus then. Because if you want the law, then you're saying the law was good enough. It was sufficient. The high priest and the sacrifices were good enough. They were sufficient. Who needs Jesus? Right? Who needs Jesus if you can just keep the old law, fill out all the check boxes, earn all the points, and stand before God on the judgment day and say, I think you'll find everything is in order here. I did all the Sabbath days. I guess you don't need Jesus then. But, verse 4, now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For see, he says, that you make all things by the pattern which was shown to you on the mountain. By pattern, he means the tabernacle is like a little earthly copy of a heavenly truth. That God in heaven, in his spiritual realm, God sits in a tabernacle in the heavens. Not something you can see with your eyes or you can touch its material with your fingertips, but it is a heavenly spiritual tabernacle, the dwelling place of God. And he says, I'm going to have you build like a little copy, like a little small version of that. And you're going to carry it around with you while you're wandering through the wilderness so that you have a place that you can go and know that God is there with you in the camp. But that's all it is. It's just a copy. It's just a little shadow. That's all it is. It's the little tiny version just to remind you of that I am with you. Don't mistake the copy for the real thing. Don't mistake your shadow for the person. And so the tabernacle was just a shadow. But now he, that's Jesus Christ, has obtained a more excellent ministry to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. And he proceeds to quote from one of the greatest Old Testament passages there is, Jeremiah 31. You want to know about the new covenant? Enacted on better promises? These are better promises. For if that first covenant, he says in verse 7, had been free of fault, then no circumstances would have been sought for a second one. But finding fault with them, with the people, with Israel, that's what our 9 a.m. lesson was all about. The problem wasn't with God, and the problem wasn't with his law. It was a good law, a holy law, and a righteous law. The failure point in this whole thing was Israel. The failure point in this whole thing was self-reliance and self-righteousness and any inkling at all that you have that you can earn your way through good deeds and practicing of the law into God's good graces. That's the failure point in this whole project. And so finding fault with them, he says in Jeremiah 31. This is a top 10 Bible passage here, okay? Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I'll bring about a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care about them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, if that sounds a lot like Exodus, that's because it is a lot like Exodus. That's what God wanted. That's what he's always wanted. He wants people who will represent him, who will love him and follow him and show his goodness to the world by their words and their actions. And they'll not teach any longer, each one his fellow citizen, each one his brother, saying, "Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. For I will be merciful toward their wrongdoings, and their sins I will remember no longer." And so when he said in the last verse here of Hebrews 8, when he said a new covenant, he's made the first one obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is about to disappear. Oh. Okay, I see what you did there. Like we said at 9 o'clock, God made a law and a covenant. He had a relationship with Israel. They were very special people to him. He pulled them out of all the nations. And he said, I'm going to make you my special people here on earth. Because I want people to know who I am. And they're going to know who I am because of who you are. You're going to be a conduit so that people can learn about me through you. And your law, the law that you're going to practice, the law that I'm giving you, they'll see the reflection of my goodness, my holiness in that law. But Israel failed. They failed badly. Not that it was a surprise to God, because he is omniscient, he knows everything, and it was all part of the plan anyway. And so he says this in Jeremiah 31. In the Old Testament, by the way, that's kind of one of those things that people have a hard time explaining away. Like, you got an Old Testament passage in the Old Testament that clearly, blatantly, obviously says, yeah, we're going to get rid of this one and replace it with a new one. And so the writer of Hebrews says, when you look at that Jeremiah 31 passage, look especially at the idea of a new covenant. He picks out that phrase in verse 13. He says, now when he says a new covenant, let's pull that phrase out. What does it mean then? What's the implication then? If there's a new covenant, what is being implied about the old covenant? That it's obsolete and it's going away. Now, again, at 9 o'clock, we talked about having a mortgage, right? You sign all the paperwork, get your house. You get buying a new house and you sign the paperwork. So there's an agreement between you and the bank. You and the bank now share a covenant with each other, a relationship with each other. And I hate to make that akin to our relationship with God because it's not a perfect analogy, okay? Covenant making in the Bible is deeper than just signing a contract, all right? God didn't show paperwork and say, well, no, we've entered into a relationship. You shall be Israel from now on, and you'll do this, 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 and this. It was more than that. But for purposes of this lesson, let's go with the mortgage, okay? Let's go ahead and go with that. Now, I've moved a couple of times in my life. I've sold some houses and bought some houses as we've moved. And there's that point. Especially if you sell and then buy a house on the same day, which if you're lucky enough to work it out where you move from one place to another, then hopefully you're lucky enough where you can sell your house and then on the same day or very shortly afterward, you can then take that money and buy that next house. And a couple of times that's worked out for us. Now, when you sell off that other house and you close that account, that mortgage is done. You've sold it off. You're done with that. And then you go sign the paperwork on the new house. Does the old bank still get to come and, hey, how come you didn't pay us this month? That's because I sold that house and we filed all the paperwork and I don't have a mortgage with you anymore. Yeah, but how come you didn't pay me? Because I sold that house. And I'm under a new covenant. And when the old covenant is obsolete, I'm not accountable to it anymore. I don't have to keep the terms of the old covenant. That old covenant's done away with, gone, run through the shredder, put in the record books, and it's in the past. I am not accountable to the terms of an obsolete covenant. And that's the point of Hebrews 8. We're not accountable to the terms of an obsolete covenant. The law, he says, it's just a shadow. And it's a shadow that's gone now because the light of God has shifted in such a way that we don't have the shadow anymore. And when you are bathed in God's light, when there's light all around you and you live in the light of God, there is no shadow anymore. The shadow's gone. It's nothing but the light. The Apostle Paul talked about the law being like a tutor in Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 through 29. He even asked a very good question. Why the law then? Great question. Why the law? Well, he says the law served a purpose. The law led us from one point in human history. We were over here. Mankind was over here, specifically Israel, God's people. And they needed to get to right about here for Jesus to come. Galatians 4 goes on and says that it was at the right time, born of a woman, born under the law, that it was at the right time that Christ came. Romans 5 says the same thing. For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Jesus Christ came and died. Which means Mount Sinai wasn't the right time. And Samuel wasn't the right time, and David wasn't the right time, and Jeremiah, even predicting that new covenant, Jeremiah 31, still wasn't the right time. But then Jesus, born of a virgin, born under the law, that was the right time. And the law was like a tutor, a kindergarten teacher. And when you're in kindergarten, you're glad to have a kindergarten teacher, but if you're trying to learn upper level calculus, you'd like to have a calculus professor there and not go back to squares and colors and shapes. Forgiveness of sins. Look at the way that the old law is described in these passages. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, the writer of Hebrews plainly says, it is impossible for the sacrifices of those animals to forgive sins. Under the old law, forgiveness of sins was impossible. I don't know about you, but the word impossible I thought means impossible. And so it is impossible for those sacrifices under the old law to forgive sins. It says in James chapter 2, is guilt. If you're guilty of one little piece of the law, but nothing else, you're actually guilty of the whole thing. If you say, well, I'm not a murderer, and I've never stolen anything, and I've never killed my neighbor's oxen before, but you did commit adultery, you are a transgressor of the whole thing. When you break one law under God, you might as well have broken them all because you're guilty of breaking the law. Romans chapter 7, Paul talks in verses 7 through 13 like, well, what's the purpose of the law then? The purpose of the law was to clarify and hone in on sin, to make sin utterly sinful, he says there. How would I have known what covetousness was unless there had been a law that said thou shalt not covet? Remember, he said back in chapter 4 of Romans, he said, where there is no law, there's no transgression. So you know what God did? God came in with thou shalt not covet. You know what we all learned? Whew, boy, I didn't realize how much coveting I was doing. If God had not said thou shalt not covet, we would not have clarified just how utterly sinful we were. The law is called weak in Romans 8, verse 3. What the law could not do, weak as it was. And one of the greatest themes of the entire New Testament is the contrast between reliance on law-keeping for righteousness and salvation versus obedient faith in Jesus Christ. The law was nailed to the cross, done away with, gone. Okay, I follow you, Ryan, but I don't know. Are you saying we just take like the 10 Commandments and just throw them out? Because I get none of us want to do the piddly things like if a lizard walks across your pottery, like you got to smash the pot and do this or that. Like I get it. There's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that I don't want to do and you don't want to do, but I don't know, it just kind of feels like, are you saying that the 10 Commandments is done away with? Are you seriously saying, and I've had this question asked of me by a Sabbatarian to my face, so are you saying that we're allowed to murder each other now? Because you're telling me we're just throwing out we're throwing out the 10 Commandments now. We can just murder and lie and steal because they're done away with. Okay, let's slow down a little bit there. Are any of us saying that we're allowed to murder just because the 10 Commandments aren't our law anymore? The answer is Jesus. 1 John chapter 2 talks about how if we want to be pleasing to God, we need to walk as he walked, do as he said, obey his commandments. So yes, Jesus does command a lot of things from us. In fact, the last time I checked in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus actually wants his law to go a little deeper than the 10 commandments. You have heard that it was said, thou shalt not murder. Yes, I'm with you there. Good enough, right? Actually, I say unto you, don't be angry with your brother. If you're angry with your brother, depending on how far you take it, name calling, insulting his intelligence, calling him a fool and an empty head, you're liable to go to hell for that. So what's interesting is, we're not tossing out the 10 commandments as much as we are replacing them with something new. Where the 10 commandments say, thou shalt not commit adultery, Jesus says, I know you've heard thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, don't even look upon a woman with lust in your heart. Because at that point, you've already committed adultery. That is what new covenant does. That is what it looks like to enact a new covenant on better promises. So yeah, I'll say it in front of you. I'll say it from the pulpit. We are not under the 10 commandments. Shocking, I know. You know what we're under? Something even better. And dare I say, something even more challenging. We would all call ourselves very lucky if we were still just under the 10 commandments. Because in a lot of ways, what Jesus asks of us is something so much better and deeper, more spiritual and much more challenging to live by than just the 10 commandments. Let me go ahead and lay out a chart for you. And I don't use charts very often, so you know it's going to be good. And this is a summation. We're almost done with the lesson. I know this is a great big bite today. We're almost done here. But let's kind of lay it out visually so we get some idea here of the old law and the new law and the gospel and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, you got the law at Mount Sinai. And like we said in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, you shall not annul these. And anybody who annuls these, well, you're going to be least in the kingdom. My words will not pass away. The laws will not pass away. Okay, I get that. I get that. Is it our job to annul the commandments of God? No. And that's something I think people who misunderstand the Old Testament really struggle with this passage. If you look at Matthew 5 and verse 17, they really struggle with this because, again, at face value it says, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. And they say, see, the old law is still in place. It's still, Jesus didn't come to take it away. Look at that word fulfill. Jesus is saying, I didn't come to put the law through the shredder. Take that mortgage, right? You take your mortgage papers and run them through the paper shredder. Jesus says, I didn't come to take it through the shredder. I came to fulfill it. I'll tell you what, there is a huge difference. Follow me here. There is a huge difference when you get a big credit card bill. Monumental, something you like, oh, I didn't know we racked up that much debt. I'm terrified. There is a huge difference between taking your credit card bill and just running it through the shredder and saying, that'll deal with it. And someone coming along and saying, oh, you were worried about that credit card bill? Don't worry. I fulfilled it for you. I paid that credit card bill for you. Your account is closed. Now, at the end of the day, both of those people might walk away going, there, the problem's dealt with. No more bill. Only one of them actually dealt with it. When Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it, what he's saying is, I didn't come to just start ripping the law to pieces and insulting it and making fun of it and snip, 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 snip. I came to fulfill it. And when something gets fulfilled, it's case closed. When the bill gets paid, the file is closed. Every requirement of the law is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So we don't have to do it anymore. Whatever debt was incurred, there you go, is paid in full. Jesus didn't come to rip the law to shreds. He came to bring it to a close. Now, when he shifts and says, okay, all right, and I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus himself puts a little qualifier there. Jesus isn't saying that the law will never go away. He's saying the law will never go away until all is accomplished. When is all accomplished? You kind of wondered, how do we answer that question? When is all accomplished? Well, crazily enough, Jesus himself answers his own question. It's done away with in the cross. Because Jesus says in John 19, verse 30, it is finished. So when is all accomplished? The cross. It is finished. Case closed, Old Testament over. Done. Gone. The gospel came in and replaced it, though. And I've got a couple passages up there under the heading of the gospel. Jesus said in Luke 16, verse 16, the law was proclaimed until John the Baptist. And ever since then, the gospel of the kingdom is being preached. And that's corroborated by a passage in Mark chapter 1 and verses 14 and 15 where it talks about Jesus himself proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. At the beginning of his ministry, the gospel of the kingdom was being preached by both John the Baptist and Jesus, eventually by his disciples as well. So what you have here, and I used the word inflection point a little while ago in the lesson, that's kind of what's going on there. That the law and the gospel had 3 years of overlap. The law was still in place until the cross, but the gospel of the kingdom was already being preached at the beginning of the ministry of John and Jesus. So there's that crossover, that kind of overlap between the old and the new. And it's in the cross where Jesus says it is finished, or Colossians 2 puts it, where it was nailed to the cross, or like 2 Corinthians chapter 3 puts it, that is the point at the cross where the old law, the old covenant, finished, paid in full, case closed, obsolete. When the new covenant comes in, the old covenant, as Hebrews 8 says, is obsolete, growing old, and disappearing. Replace them with a new covenant. And this is the last point we'll make in Hebrews chapter 12. Here in Hebrews chapter 12, he contrasts the old with the new. Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, which this is a whole sermon on its own, I promise. It's not going to be a whole sermon today. Unless you want to do part 3. But here in Hebrews chapter 12, and let's just read it and let it speak for itself, and we'll offer an invitation. Look at the contrast between the old and the new, the fear of the old with the joy of the new. He says in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18, for you Christians, you have not come to a mountain that may be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind. He's talking about Exodus here. He's talking about Mount Sinai. He's talking about a mountain that was so terrifying that the people dared not touch it. Even if their animals touched it, they'd be struck dead. And to the blast of a trumpet, the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further words should be spoken to them. Back in Exodus, when they heard the booming voice of God, they begged Moses, tell him not to do that anymore. That's really, really scary when he talks to us. For they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. That's the old law. You want to keep the old law? That's what you have. You want to keep the old law? That's the fear. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. That's what you have. So I say, as the writer of Hebrews says, is his main point in this entire book of Hebrews, why would you want the old when you can have the new? Why would you want the inferior when you can have the superior? When you have all that is perfect in Jesus Christ, why would you want that which is weak and impossible to save and dying and growing old and obsolete and disappearing? And that is my challenge to anybody who wants to take things from the Old Testament, rip them out of their context, and shove them onto other people's lives. Now, this doesn't mean the Old Testament doesn't teach us things. And we'd be remiss if we didn't make this point. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul talks about these examples. He says there are examples of people in the Old Testament. And those examples teach us things, concepts. The examples don't teach us to follow the same laws that they follow. The examples teach us to honor God. The example of the Israelites in 1 Corinthians 10 that he talks about is in the wilderness. We learn from their example not to crave evil things, not to practice idolatry, not to test God the way that they tested God. And all of those things in the wilderness happened as examples for us to learn from them. So we learn from the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean that we are under the law of the Old Testament. We learn from Nadab and Abihu that when you approach God, you better approach him as holy. For God says, I am holy, therefore you are to be holy. I don't learn from Nadab and Abihu that I'm supposed to come to the church building with the right kind of fire starter and start the incense before Sunday worship service. That's not what I learned from Nadab and Abihu. I learn that I need to honor God. And so we look at the Old Testament not as a set of laws to be followed, but as a great big thousands-year-long case study in who God is and how he wants to relate to his people. Now, if you're not a Christian here this afternoon, you really ought to be. Because you have not yet tasted of the grace of Jesus Christ. You have not yet known what it is to have your sins washed away and to live in a new covenant with your Creator, your Maker, your Heavenly Father who loves you so very, very much. So please listen to the words of Jesus himself. In Mark 16, verse 16, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he who does not believe shall be condemned. And I hope that you'll take those words to heart. And if you have any spiritual need at all this morning, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.